Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the From Adversity to Abundance podcast. I am your host, Jamie Bateman, and I'm thrilled today to have with us Juliet Hahn. Juliet has many different titles and roles, and I'm pumped to get into that. Juliet, why don't you tell us what you're up to today?
Yeah. So, I am a CCO. So I'm a chief communications officer for a company called FetTech. I am also a podcast host. I have 3 different podcasts, and I am a storyteller, content creator. And on top of that, I am a wife and a mom. And it sounds like crazy, but when it's kind of seasons in life, when things flow, I'm the type of person that just goes with it and kind of sees what, kind of is budding and where my interest and needs and passions really kind of follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited about this one. I know storytelling is the foundation of what you do. And I think that's kind of sounds like a common thread through all of your different various ventures and parts of your journey thus far. And we're going to get into why that's evolved as become one of your primary strengths. And I do think it's a critical, this is going to be both inspirational and practical for the listener, because I know a lot of entrepreneurs and budding entrepreneurs and wannabe entrepreneurs think, should I start a podcast? How do I, should I go on a podcast? Should I be, how do I tell my story? And there's a lot we can dive into on the practical side for sure. So from adversity to abundance, we talk a lot about human adversity on this show. It's a human-based story. It is for entrepreneurs, a human-based podcast. It is for entrepreneurs, and we do talk about business and and money and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's the human element that kind of where we all kind of come together and we can all relate. And so I know you've been through some real adversity in your life. We're not going to stay on the adversity, but let's jump back and let's talk a little bit about your backstory and what you've learned to deal with and address on a regular basis. So where would you like to start, Juliet?
Well, I love that you just said that, because there's so many things. My struggles have really become my strengths. And that is something that I talk about a lot on really all my podcasts. But so we'll take you back to kind of one of my first memories in school was the entire class in 3rd grade was taken to gifted and talented, except myself and another boy. And he was the troublemaker in class. We were taken to special reading, and it was very known, like, okay, you guys are all going here. I had a lot of friends. I was the athletic kid, like on the playground. I was the fastest. I was actually the fastest kid in the class. I beat all the boys. So I had, a lot of strengths, but then there was things in school. And that was the first time I really realized, wait a second, there's something different. And so I am dyslexic, ADHD, it is a hereditary 1 in 5, my dad, my sister, probably, we haven't traced it back to which grandparent, but we all have our ideas. My son, one of my children, and then also tons of nieces and nephews. But learning in the classroom how to kind of engage and interact with the teachers are what now became something that I became really strong at. And that was communicating. That was the human connection. That was trying to figure out how to get out of things. And basically, I didn't want the teacher to know, wait, I don't know what you're saying. There's so many times. And, I do talk about this on one of my podcasts. It's called Word Blindness, Dyslexia Exposed. It is a podcast on dyslexia. My co-host is a former NHL hockey Stanley Cup winner who was diagnosed with dyslexia when he was 32. He never even heard the word. So we really are bringing those stories out there, our stories, but then others, and the importance of really knowing, okay, if you're struggling in school, there's something behind it, because kids don't ever want to get in trouble. When you're kindergarten, 1st grade, you want to know that answer. You don't want to be
you
the
want to
class
fit in.
clown.
Yeah, you don't want to draw attention to yourself, especially for having a challenging, if actually talk about that. I mean, we had Matt Four on the show. He was one of the first guests on my podcast, and actually he's featured in our new book that we just put out. And he talked a lot about his own dyslexia growing up and how actually reading is like his favorite thing to do now. And he's just read like thousands of books, and he has a podcast now as well, which is amazing. So not saying it's the exact same story, but there are a lot of similarities in that what was a major challenge for him became one of his biggest strengths. And so, talk about, I guess, really, for the audience listener who may not actually know what dyslexia is, can you just define it for us and kind of describe exactly what it is?
So it is a reading disorder, but it is also a processing. So I always could read. There's always levels. I always could read, but when I was reading, I would read very slowly and I wasn't processing what I was reading. So when I listened to something, so I listened to all my books,
Yeah.
right now, as I said, I'm the chief communications officer for a company. And so you would think, well, wait a second, but communication is actually my strength. I learned really early on that if I used my voice, I could get things different than if I was writing. So a lot of times for me, my dyslexia, I could have all these huge, great, big, huge ideas, and I can tell you all about them. I go to put them on a piece of paper and they literally do not come out of my head onto a piece of paper. I have to voice text everything. I have to, I have to, audio is like my friend. So again, technology nowadays is a lot better, but like thinking about a kid in the classroom, I have this big story I want to write, right? You're writing the story in third grade and it's amazing and you have it all in your head and you go to write it and you
Yeah. And you
can't write
can't,
it.
nothing comes
And the
out.
teacher's like,
Yeah.
well, what's wrong with you? Right? Pay attention, stop fidgeting,
Right.
focus.
Right.
What are you doing? Why are you talking to your friend? Half of the time it
Right.
was because like, what did the teacher said? What are we supposed to be doing? Because I was
Right.
always one step behind because I wasn't the kid that got in trouble. I had a lot of friends. My
Yeah.
mom was in the education system. My older sister also struggled. I'm one of five. And so it was known that, okay, things are not coming as easy. But the one thing that's really important, dyslexia is not an IQ. Half
Okay.
of self-made billionaires, I forget
Yeah.
the number, but it's like
Yeah.
40% are dyslexic. We actually
Wow.
think very differently. Our brains are wired differently. And so our right brains are wired. We're more creative. But the thing
Yeah.
that's really interesting, when I was in school, that day that the kids went to gifted and talented, all my friends
Yeah.
came back and they're like, what did you go do? We did this amazing stuff. They were creating, and I can still remember, they were creating a knight and javelin and they were doing mazes and they're like, we're drawing and coloring and creating things. And so that day I told myself I wasn't creative because I couldn't draw. Instead of being like, okay, I struggled in reading and I'm not good in
Yeah.
school, I said to myself, I'm not creative.
You're
And
not
so
creative. Right.
that's the path
Yeah.
I kind of went down on my podcast. And a lot of things I do talk about is the innate confidence. Some of us are just innately confident. I was I was born innately confident. So I had a lot of strengths and I had a
Yeah.
family that would talk about my strengths a lot. But in school, they constantly talk about the things you're not good at. You
Sure.
need to work harder on
Absolutely.
this. You're not good at this, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but like I had a lot of teachers that would give me a hard time, like, why
Yeah.
can't you just focus? Because I did go to college. I played 2 college sports. I was very, very athletic. So I was on top of the athletic field,
Yeah.
but, closer at the bottom of the education. I came from a place that everyone was really good at everything in my head. I mean, it was an affluent
Right.
town right
Right.
outside of Philadelphia on the New Jersey side.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different things that, you give yourself that narrative, like when everything,
Right.
everyone's pretty good at, and you're like, why can't I get it? You beat
Right.
yourself up a little bit. But then
Sure.
again, when you have the positives, when you find out what your strengths are, that's why it's really important to really kind of find out if you are dyslexic and if you have
Yeah.
like ADHD, dysgraphia. There's all these different things, but as soon as you can kind of remediate it, you're never not going to have it. That's one thing that's
Yeah.
really important. You're never not going to have it.
There's not a
But
cure for it. You're not going to
no.
just move on from it. Right.
And
But you,
school
yeah.
and stuff is always going to be hard. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no, it's, but you
Sure.
work harder. That's a lot of times I work harder. I have
Yeah.
failed so many times that I will start something. So a lot of
Yeah.
entrepreneurs are dyslexic. It's like, oh yeah, I
Yeah.
don't care. I'm going to go
Which
put
is
myself out there.
interesting that you say about the, you're not creative. I know you're not saying that now, but that was
No,
the
right.
narrative you were telling
Yeah.
yourself and that your teachers were telling you basically. But it turns out actually because of that the challenging situation, you become more creative. I mean, entrepreneurs at the end of the day, that's what they do is they create and they add value, they create things, and they are the definition of creativity, really. So you definitely are creative, that's for sure. So now, because I do feel like dyslexia, this is just me, right? And just, it's been around forever, not forever, but it's one of those
1800s. In the 1800s,
yeah, okay,
that was called
okay,
word blindness.
okay,
That's why we
okay,
named our thing. But I mean, it's
got it.
crazy and how
Yeah.
they still really don't know. But go ahead.
Right. Okay. But no, I just like, nowadays and frankly, I have 2 teenagers and we're dealing with some different challenges as well. And so I've learned a lot more about like, just different ADHD and autism and mental health and different things. And I feel like dyslexia is one that, just from my, vantage point, maybe gets pushed or viewed as like less challenging, or just not that big of a deal, or just so it's kind of like, that's cool, but that's okay. You switched a couple of letters and, just switch them back or something.
I mean, but that's the thing, that's why we are doing the podcast that we're doing, because it's so much more. And then it also comes down to the self-esteem, right? You have to, if you don't have self-esteem. And so a lot of times dyslexic kids, if they don't have the support, or they don't know what's going on, it's like, they do get that beat up. But it is, so if I can't spell, I mean, I still spell like a second grader, which is super frustrating. Think about taking notes. So the college, all of that stuff, taking notes, I would look back and be like, I don't even know what that says.
So
because it's tough. It's really tough.
Now, before we move, more into your story, how what is some advice for somebody who thinks they might have dyslexia, or maybe their child does? I mean, just what's the first step to finding out if you may have it?
You want to get a neuropsych, and they're expensive. It sucks. They do take time, but it's one of those things. And again, and we talk about this a lot in the other in my word blindness podcast, so I'm not going to get into it, but education is a broken system.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's really sometimes disheartening. Myself going through it, having a child's gone through it. We were actually very fortunate. He went to a dyslexia school for 3 years. So we were really fortunate, but it is getting that neuropsych is really important, but not counting on the school to do it, because the school is going to do it their way. And a lot of states they can't say you have dyslexia. It's just an LD, or and when a teacher gets that, it's like, okay, there's a wide range of things that you can do to remediate. So there's things like Orton Gillingham. There's ways that dyslexic people can learn to read. Now, the most severe dyslexic person will probably never be able to, but most ranges, if you do like Orton Gillingham or different reading things, you can. So like once you find out, and if you're ADHD, there's different things. A lot of dyslexic are ADHD, but again, ADHD gets that bad rap. I mean, I have ADHD, but my EQ, that's one of the things I wanted to say before, like my EQ and self-awareness and reading other people is like off the charts, because that's my gift. That's God gave me that. It's like, okay, you might struggle here. It's just like a blind or deaf person. You get stronger things. So it's just really important to know where those strengths and weaknesses are and to really build it up. So the neuropsych, going to a doctor outside of the school is really important.
No, and that gets to, and we will, move on into your story more, but that just gets to the point. I mean, my mother is a retired public school teacher. My whole family is teachers, or in the public school system in some way, and private as well. But and they're all great people, right? But you're absolutely right. There's so many shortcomings to the system itself, and we've dealt with that with like my son's IEP, for example, and lots of challenges there. The public school system in general has a lot of room for improvement. We'll leave it there. And that gets to the point of the show, really, which is take ownership of your life, point to your strengths, look at your strengths. We're not saying you don't have those challenges, and you do need to face those challenges and deal with them and not pretend they're not there, but own it, and own your situation, and look to the people in your world that can help you and help you move forward. And that way you can end up being the best version of yourself and impact people in the most positive way possible. So walk us through, kind of fast forward through the next, say, 10 years of your life. What did things look like, from school and then into your professional life?
So I did, as I said, I did go to college. I became a communications major. Surprising. It wasn't the first path though. I was going to be, corporate fitness because of fitness. But, again, some of the classes I was like, nope, not going to do that. Found my way into communications, realized I love this, went into advertising, moved to New York City, got a job even before I graduated, did really well in college because I started learning things that I really was interested in and learned how I learned, which was really important. Again, figured out, okay, where are those weaknesses, how I can kind of work with them and how I can kind of, elevate them, know that they're still there, as you said, but kind of really work off my strengths,
Sure.
which, as I said, I have some really good strengths. Yeah. I have some
Yeah.
weaknesses, but really good, some strong strengths. So
Yeah.
met my husband, and then I chose to stay home, raised 3
Yeah.
kids. I have 3 teenagers. So, did
Yeah.
that. And as I went, I always was networking. I was always, connecting with people. I
Yeah.
was always the person that was like, oh, wait, you're doing this. You know what? I need to connect you with this person. Always knew every shopkeeper, knew everyone's story, because I always asked questions. I'm a very, very curious person. So I always asked questions. I don't get into like hour long, but I, would sit and connect with most people. It's one of the things that I think is important. And a lot of people don't do. They don't look around themselves. Everyone, a lot of times in this world too, with our lives,
Yeah.
we all have stuff, right? We all have trauma. We all have stuff going
Sure.
on. We all have hard days, but I always make sure I'm looking around me, because someone
Yeah.
else might be having a harder day and maybe I can impact them. And that's something that
Yeah.
I really raised my kids. They're teenagers now, so sometimes they
Yeah.
forget
Yeah.
that,
Oh
but it's
yeah.
important to do that. So, as I did,
Absolutely.
I always stayed connected to people. And we moved to a community where I was like, you know what? I was doing some fitness stuff in the other community, kind of helping moms stay healthy. I was at that same
Yeah.
kind of stage, and our kids would be playing, and I was like, hey, let's, I could do a workout for, because again, I played 2 sports. I've always had that mindset. I've always worked hard.
Yeah.
Dyslexia, you always work harder because you got to. And so from there, it was like, okay, we had just moved. Walking is like something that I do. And this is one of
Yeah.
the things that I talk about on my podcast a lot. If you ever feel like you're stuck, or you're like, what's going on? Where do I want to go? What do I want to do? I always say to people, you need to daydream. And I think, again, a lot of people don't allow themselves to
Mhm.
daydream because they're scared that it's not going to happen. And maybe they're stuck in life. I'm sure you talk about the golden handcuffs on here.
Oh yeah.
People
Absolutely.
get stuck in their jobs and they're like, how do I get out
Yeah.
of it? And I
Right.
always say, you're not a
Absolutely.
tree. You're not a tree. You don't have to stick with what you are. So even if
It's
you're
true.
making money and
Yeah.
you're the sole breadwinner, but you're miserable, you're not
Yeah.
helping anyone else. You have one life. So I say daydream.
Absolutely.
I have to move. My
Yeah. To daydream,
dyslexia,
you got to
ADHD.
move. Yeah.
I can't
Absolutely.
meditate. I
Yeah.
sit, I think about dishes and laundry.
Right. 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 Yeah.
And it's
I've
not
never
good.
been. I tried meditating too. It just. Yeah. I'm with you. It didn't stick. Maybe I'm sure I could get better at it, but no, I completely have come around. And I played lacrosse in college, and I was in the military. Was always very active and
Mhm.
type A as far as I guess achieving and things like that. But I always kind of looked down on, not looked down on, but I thought walking was kind of a waste of time, to be honest with you, because it was like, well, I'll just run and get it over with.
Right.
And to be honest, now my wife and I walk quite a bit together or separately, and it is amazing.
Oh,
Like, I
it's one of my
mean,
favorite things to do.
it's not only a great physical workout, it's really allowed me to have that space to develop the mental clarity
Mhm.
that's just critical. I mean, and it's honestly easier to stay busy. It's a cop out to stay busy, and I have plenty of things to stay busy with. But just allowing yourself that space to think and daydream,
Mhm.
like you said, that's amazing. That's really good. So that's a big part of your life.
I
And so
I
yeah,
do
go
it
ahead.
every morning. I have 2 boxers. I do it every morning, 7
Yeah.
days a week, rain, snow, whatever. I walk them. We walk probably an hour, 3 miles, and it is my time that I daydream, and I just dream about what I want to do. And at this point in my life, we had just moved. I had just lost a friend
Hmm.
to frontal lobe dementia at 40. It was really
Wow.
sad, and I was just feeling like I want to do more. My husband's working, we just moved to this community. I don't really want to do the fitness stuff.
Yeah.
And then I was like, you know what? I love podcasts. I'm going to start a podcast. I love talking. I love
Yeah.
telling stories. I'm
Yeah.
going to talk about this phase of my life. This phase of
Yeah.
my life. I was in my mid 40s, early to mid 40s. And I was like, this is an important time, because I've talked to a lot of women that maybe stayed home or even didn't stay home and are trying to juggle it all. And talk to men that are, at that same too, like, oh, I don't
Yeah.
love what I do anymore. So I'm going to start telling stories. So I
Yeah.
ran home, told my kids and my husband I'm going to start a podcast. They were like, "Oh, do you know how to start a podcast?" I said, "No, I'm going to figure it out." When I
Yep.
tell you that, because again, I figure everything out. It's like I can do this. If I fail, I fail. You know what? If it's not meant to
I
be, I
love
do
that.
believe whether it's God or the universe, if there's a path, like if that came to my mind, I can't tell you how many times, like a podcast, you like to talk. No. I was like, okay, I'm going to follow it. And so I am that type of person. If I daydream and something keeps coming up, I'm like, okay, I believe that's God whispering, right?
Sure.
Whispering like, hey, go follow that, see where it takes you.
Yeah.
So I jumped in. We were going away. Our oldest son was playing soccer in Sweden. And so my husband's like, are you really starting it now? Because again, remember dyslexia and attention deficit. So I sometimes am very impulsive and I'm like, oh, I'm doing it. And I literally, if I say I'm going to do something, I will do it. And it will be like, that's all I can focus on. I over focus and I will get it done though. So like sometimes it's a great attribute to have. So he's like, well, just pause. And he's a very good partner because he'll pause me at times. He's like, is this, do you really want to let it go now because of, we're traveling? And I was like, you're right. You know what? So I could have had it out literally in a month, but it took like 2 months from start to finish.
Yeah.
I started telling personal journal stories and I started connecting with people and people were reaching out to me and saying, thank you for sharing that. And a lot of it was kind of hot mess moments as a mom when my kids were little. And I always say I was, a really good mom. I'm a great mom, good wife, terrible housewife. And I chose to stay home, but I was like, ooh, I'm not really good at cooking and I don't really like any of that stuff, but I got to do it. So I had a lot of funny stories, right? I had a lot of funny stories, but a lot of vulnerable stories that I thought needed to be shared.
Well, I think that's the key is the vulnerability. And I think that's what people are really craving these days, because all we see on social media is the great, how everything's so wonderful and all the highlights, and that's fine. And, we all probably, I know I do that, and I have no issue with seeing somebody's vacation pictures. I'd rather see that than their pile of laundry or something. But at the end of the day, it's just, so refreshing when someone is actually vulnerable, and we can all relate to that on some level. I mean, so I think people are starved for that type of vulnerability and authenticity. So, I mean, that I was listening to a podcast yesterday about podcasting and just how that's really the solo episodes where the host is just vulnerable, get a lot of downloads and a lot of positive feedback. So to the entrepreneur out there who's thinking about starting a podcast, we'll just frame it that way. I know you had a bunch of signs through walking and things like that. But what are, one or two kind of practical tips you could give someone for deciding even whether to start a podcast?
Yeah. I mean, I talk about this a lot with people because again, it seems like, oh, you could just go do it. Right. There's a lot behind it and it's not for everyone. And there's nothing wrong with it being that way. So what I always suggest first is getting your phone. Everyone has a phone or a tape recorder and just sitting first thinking, okay, do I want to interview? Do I want to do solo episodes? And just talk and see how long you can talk. But what I always really suggest is talking about your own story, really reflecting, doing that self-reflection, talk back and just talk, let it all like kind of brain dump. Do it when you're walking or when you're sitting, if you're someone that needs to sit, but just literally get it and see how long you can do it and how comfortable you are. And then re-listen to it. And maybe you don't re-listen to it. I don't usually re-listen to stuff, but some people like to re-listen to it. But don't re-listen to it in the critical way. Just see, okay, you know what? I could feel my energy go up here. I could feel my energy go down here. I could feel my energy get a little weird here. These are things maybe I need to think about. So really diving into yourself first is, I think, to me, whether it doesn't matter what kind of podcast you want to start, you want to be comfortable enough to have a conversation, but also bring in some of your own self. Because this is also for an entrepreneur. And I know we're going to get into this, but bringing in the parts of your own story that are going to connect deeper with an audience is going to help you grow your business. It doesn't matter, what you're selling, what service you have. If you're creating a community because of who you are and your parts of your story, that community is going to grow and it's going to grow. And if you have a great product, that's great, because then that's going to blow up. If you have a crappy product, your community is going to grow, but maybe not get, deep, not wide. It might be there. You might get new people all the time because you're connecting with people. And then it's like, oh, nothing happens over here. But if you get both and you're connecting with the community and you're, engaging them and talking about things and you're still growing because you're getting new people, that's what's really important. So the first thing you do is get your phone and do it for like 2 weeks. Okay, I'm going to sit and talk about this part again. okay, I'm going to sit. Now, again, this is not like some people have had a lot of trauma in their life. I'm not a
Yeah.
therapist. I'm not telling you to go and
Yeah.
do a therapy session, but just talk about different aspects of your life. And then, okay, if you're going to do solo episodes, how did that feel? What other topics are you going to talk about? You know, how
Yeah.
many do you have? Are you going to be able to grow the seasons? Now, I did solo and then COVID hit. And I was like, you know what? I'm really curious of what's happening around the world with people and COVID. So I was like, I'm just going to start reaching out to random people on social media, seeing if they want to do COVID stories with me. I started
Yeah.
interviewing, and then I became like, I was like, okay, this is my gift. I'm really good at interviewing. I ask
Hmm.
questions. People are like, oh my God, no one's ever asked me that. I was helping people connect dots, and
Yeah, because of
fireworks were going
your
off.
high EQ, right? You're able to read people and
Exactly.
dig in somewhere else that the other past interviewers haven't been able to find. Yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
really good. And interviewing is absolutely a skill. There's no doubt about it. And there's not one way to do it. And I'm not saying I'm the greatest at it or anything, but it is very different than storytelling for sure. But if you're good at storytelling, you're probably going to be good at drawing out a story from someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So when you started your podcast, I know you have 3 now. What was the goal?
It was a creative outlet, and I was missing a creative outlet, and I didn't realize it because, again, remember, I said I wasn't creative, so I really did not think, because I couldn't draw and I don't sing. So I
Yeah.
was like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
not creative. But
Right.
I've been storytelling my whole life. When my kids were little, I can't tell you how many different characters and stories that I would create. These, like, I mean, I can't believe I didn't make them into children's series, because anywhere we went, the kids would be like, Mama, tell us the story about blah blah blah. And I would, tell them about these elaborate stories. And I would have sometimes people come up and they're like, oh, that's such a cool story. Where'd you hear it? And I'm like, oh, I just made it up. I just have that creative brain, but I never thought of it as a creativity, because I was
Sure.
always that way. But
Yeah.
one thing I do want to touch base, when you
Yeah.
said the EQ, the other
Yeah.
thing is, because of my dyslexia, I learned
Mm.
to read people really well, of like how to
Mm.
get out of things. So I could
Mm.
read someone's body language. So when I'm talking to someone, I can
Mhm.
tell, okay, they sped up a little bit. I can tell
Mhm.
I can see how someone moves. I can see if they slow down. I am so on cue to reading people. Again, yes,
Mhm.
it's my EQ, but it's what I built because of a
Mhm.
weakness. And
Right.
that's
Right.
what's really cool. So that's like the reflection that I want people to do, especially entrepreneurs, because it's going to
Sure.
connect somewhere in there that they're going to be like, oh, I understand now why this is why I'm so good. Like, we all are born with skills and not skills, but
Sure.
the ones that you sharpen, like, why are you so sharp in that? Really go back and think about that.
Mm.
So, but so yes, I mean,
That's
that
really
is,
good.
it is, and it's really important. But again, it's that self-reflection. Not everyone likes to self-reflect. Again, people have trauma, but you can self-reflect in a way that you're not opening yourself up. And and if you feel like maybe you talk to a therapist, go talk to a
Sure.
professional. Do this in a therapy session if you talk to a therapist and see, okay, I can do that. But those are the kind of,
Yeah.
just tips that I talk about a lot.
Absolutely. So it's a creative outlet, and then it branched into 2 additional podcasts. So okay, now I guess whether any other quick tips as far as running a podcast, things that have maybe something that hasn't worked for you?
Well, I very quickly realized I didn't like editing. And I
Yeah.
knew that if I stayed with podcasting and I had to edit myself, I wouldn't have stayed. So that's the other thing. You have to really think about your strengths and weaknesses. Again,
Yeah.
I sometimes sound like a broken record, but I knew that was not a strength of mine. I am not a detailed oriented person. I
Yeah.
know a lot of women are. I am not one of them. I am not detailed, and that kind of stuff would frustrate the hell out of me. So I knew very quickly that I was going to get an editor. So another thing, someone might say, okay, I don't have the finances to do that. There's so
Yeah.
many different things that you could do. I mean, I think my husband does well. I didn't want my
Yeah.
husband funding any of this. I wanted to do this on
Mm.
my own. I didn't want this to
Mhm.
be my passion project, but then
Yeah.
become his financial project. That I
Sure.
didn't want to do that. And I was like very clear about that. There was times, yes, that I was like, oh, didn't didn't
Yeah.
really organize that. Can you help here? But I didn't want that. So as I said, I had done some fitness stuff that I still was doing a couple, I didn't want to grow that, but I was like, I can still work with some clients. I know what my skills are. I can help get a little income there, put it
Yeah.
back into the podcast. There was
Yeah.
a time, as I said, I have boxers. There was a family that needed someone to babysit a puppy boxer. And I was like, I'll do that. So then they were like, well, we'll pay you if you really do it during the day. And I'm like, I'm home. Of course, I have 2 others. They can just hang out. So I
Sure.
did that. I got a little income there.
Yeah.
And so then I put that back into the podcast. So I knew I wanted to put the money into the editing and that I was going to be good at everything else. Cause that's the other thing is putting a deadline, not putting a deadline, being like, well, when it gets hard or doesn't feel right, I'm going to stop. Because how many
Right.
times does that happen when people stop something too early?
Absolutely.
I gave
Yep.
myself a year deadline. Doesn't matter how easy or how
Yeah.
hard. And
That's
then I
good.
could
Yeah.
say, I did it.
Yeah.
Great. What did I learn from
There's,
it? But it wasn't for me, but obviously it was.
I've heard, there's like something like 4 million plus podcasts out there, and
Mhm.
only about 15% have produced content in the last 30 to 60 days, something like that.
Yes.
And I know that's how we connected, as I listened to you on the Cap Show podcast,
Mhm.
which was really good.
Love Cap Show.
Absolutely. We use it as well. It's really, really good. So now, okay, so that's about, creating a podcast, running a podcast. And so I would agree with you. Give it at least a year. I mean, don't do this if you're going to do it for 2 weeks and just give up because it got a little bit challenging, because there is a ton of work to this, no doubt about it. But maybe, so talk to the person they don't want to start a podcast. They realize it's too much work. It's just not their thing. Maybe they want to try it in 10 years, but they realize there's value as an entrepreneur, or as anyone really, in going on other podcasts and going on shows and telling their story. Because I know that's something that you've helped a lot of people with, that you used to help people with, professionally, getting that storytelling skill kind of to be elevated, if you will. So what are, one or two tips you can give to someone who's going to be going on podcasts or just sharing their story? What can you tell someone in that situation?
Yeah, no. And I had actually one of my clients just recently, someone found her because of a podcast, because of the work that we had done in the past, because it is really important. Like you could go on podcast and for an entrepreneur, I say, go on as many podcasts as you have. There's so many different services out
Absolutely.
there, but you don't need to spend money if you don't have that. You can go do your own research and you can send it. There's so many levels of podcasts. So many people are
Yeah,
looking for good stories. And sometimes the
absolutely.
smaller podcast have a more, kind of dense audience. They
Yeah,
have their listeners that listen, and
they're
maybe
more
it's
committed.
30, maybe
Yeah.
it's 50, maybe it's, 100,
Yeah.
maybe it's 1,000, but those listen every day. And when they hear something, they are sharing it with their community and then it's going
Right.
out there. So even if you get one or two clients every couple months, that's more than you're getting if you're not going out there
Yeah,
and
no,
doing
that's
it.
absolutely. As hosts, we get very hung up on download numbers and unique listeners per episode and that kind of thing, which is great. And you can check we use co-host, which provides some pretty good analytics, I certainly want my download numbers to keep going up and up and up. But at the end of the day, does that really matter? I mean, quality
Mm-hmm.
is really important. So having that listener that comes back, that's what you want.
Yeah.
So, to your point, I get a lot more, as much as I love being a host and I love my podcast and it's one of my passion projects for sure. I get a lot more traction when I go on other shows, if I'm just
Mm-hmm.
being honest, because it opens me up to all these other networks and I get a lot more people
Right.
reaching out after I'm a guest on a show. So storytelling, just what are a couple of kind of basic, I guess, principles to be able to tell a good story?
Yeah. And I'm just going to take it one step back there because as you
Yeah.
said, like you go on podcasts and if you're telling your story correct, you found me because of me, the way I was
Mm-hmm.
telling my story in another
Mm-hmm.
podcast. So
Yep.
sometimes if you just are doing great work, you're going to have people reaching out to you. Hey, can you be on my podcast? And you're not doing the other things. The other thing is someone might say, hey, I just had a great guest. You have a little network of podcast hosts that you're friends with that you're like,
Yep.
I just had this great guest. You know what? I'm going to recommend you. But if you're the
Absolutely.
person that doesn't know how to tell your story and you're all over the place, you're going to be doing a lot more work because you're not going to have the recommendations. You're not going to have the people wanting to come back and listen to you because you were all over the place or you just weren't hitting the right spot. So what I always say is, there's a lot of different things. Goes back to that exercise of you telling
Yeah.
your whole story from literally when you were little, your first memories, and talk about, I mean, it can be like, hi, I'm, John, I have 3 siblings. I lived in Nebraska, and giving those details, but details that are coming up and you're remembering. And so when you're doing that on your own, and
Mm-hmm.
then you're like, and this is what I used to do with clients, is I would say, okay, Now, the things that you just touched on, but I personally could listen and be like, okay, I saw
Mhm.
how you literally lit up, and you went from slow talking to being uncomfortable talking about your past to
Yeah.
that one day in fifth grade when you had that pivotal moment and you lit up, and they're like, oh, I didn't think that was that important. And I'm like, your energy and the way
Yeah.
you presented yourself is what's going to attract the outside
Mm.
world. So I had a guest, just an example. I love to give examples, and then
Yeah.
it kind of people
Yeah.
understand that's the way my brain works. But so I had a guest that was a business coach, and she started telling me this story, and I didn't work with her before, so she was just coming on. She was on the
Hmm.
podcast circuit. She said, "Oh, I just kind of have the silly story about pink peonies." But it's really not important. I was like, well, no, I just want to hear about, I love pink peonies. Like, what
Hmm.
is your story? And she basically took me through this pink peony story. And the way she lit up was insane. And she still gets clients now that are like, I connected because that pink peony story that had nothing to do with what her business was, but
Right.
it was her friend gave her a pink peony when she was leaving the corporate world to start her own business. And it was her grandmother's
Nice.
favorite flower, and it made
Yeah.
her feel something. And this friend didn't know that it was the grandmother's favorite flower. So it just became this big, important piece of her life.
Sure.
And that transition is what then connected to the audiences, and she still gets business because of that little story.
That's
And
awesome.
it's those kind of things that sometimes you think something's not significant. We all have stories, right? There's some people that have
Sure.
some trauma, and you're like, well, I can't, they went through all of this, and how am I going to ever kind of, be up to par with that? But it doesn't matter, because we all have an audience. We all have people that need to hear what we're saying. I say it all the time. You can learn from a janitor to a homeless person to a president
Yes.
to a CEO to,
Yeah.
the top executives in the world, to athletes to actors. We can learn from all of it. We just need to listen. And a lot of times we don't let ourselves listen because we think, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. But sometimes they might say something
Yeah.
and you're like, wait, that's interesting. I want to think more about that. And when someone says that, that's sort of something that you need to follow. You need to start researching. You need to ask questions about, because we need to light ourselves up sometimes. And especially when you're in that stagnant world. So that's the first
Yeah.
thing you do. You do that exercise. You kind of pick those things out. You get excited about little things that, like, okay, I'm excited about that thing that happened to me in third grade because it was really, I'm talking about my
Yeah.
third grade. I hated that thing. But
Right.
people
Right.
also understand a
Yeah.
little bit about who I am.
Sure. No, and it's just getting back to the being vulnerable and being authentic, and who are you really deep down. And I love that point you made about we can all learn from anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I just hired a business coach actually, and he there's some kind of quote he used. There was a quote he used the other day, which was something about every man is my superior in some way, right? And
Mm-hmm.
obviously it's man, woman, child, anybody. It's
Yeah.
but it's absolutely true. I mean, we can all learn from everyone. So, so you're doing that exercise to figure out really kind of what lights you up, what is your
Yeah.
source of energy, really, and about your own story, right? And then highlight those elements of your backstory. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Right. And then as you're doing it, you're going to start connecting dots. Again, people hire people to help them do this, but sometimes
Sure.
people are introspective and they can kind of figure it out themselves. I mean, I have
Yeah.
so many people with this new position I'm working in the regenerative medicine space. This is
Yeah.
I'm the chief communication officer for this company. They happen to be one of my first storytelling clients. So it's a really cool kind of
Yeah.
whole thing. But I'm working with a lot of scientists right now on helping them be able to connect the dots and talk about
Yeah.
their story. And they're like, this is so weird. But then I've had them, literally leave me messages like, okay, there's so many things that I just
Yeah.
connected because I'm thinking about this. So you don't have to have a professional person, but when you're doing this exercise, you're thinking back to those little memories that you have throughout your life. Now, I also talk about there's memory feelings and there's memory visions, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes
Okay.
those memory feelings are more important than the actual little memories. Like if I think back to my childhood, we all have those little like things that we do. Some of us
Sure.
stuff certain things because again, it's trauma. But
Yeah.
sometimes like if you think like I remember being like, why every time we talk about like elementary school do I get this like pit? And it was
Yeah.
like, oh, That's when I like had to go to special reading, and everyone, and the teacher that
Sure.
brought me to special reading, she was a slow talker, and there was all this stuff around, like
Mm.
slow talkers. No offense to any slow talkers, but they drives me nuts. Like I'm like, oh my God, just say what you want to say. And it
Right.
kind of all came full circle. But those are the kind of things that you want to dive into, like those
Sure.
good memory feelings. The I don't know. Like I had a client and with someone that was on my podcast that talked about when she was growing up, and she's like, there was just always this great feeling in my house. And so we really dove into it. And it was because both of her parents were immigrants and they lived in a very different area. But in her house, it was like both of their cultures that they
Hmm.
brought in. And it literally, she would walk out and it would be this entirely different world. They were the only kind of diverse
Mm.
people in their community.
Sure.
So she's like, it was just, but she's like, but it was such a like, my home was my happy place
Mm.
outside. And then we dove into all these different
Yeah.
things. And it's one of the things she leads with all the time now because of what she learned in both of those experiences.
Yeah. So you mentioned leads with, and I'm just curious before we move on, um, as far as the framework for telling your story, is what should you lead with? Or do you lead with like a teaser, or how do you frame the actual storytelling? If I'm going to go on a podcast for 30 minutes and the whole goal is to tell my story, is there a particular framework you recommend?
No, I mean, you have to listen to who the host is, right? You're going on someone else's
Sure.
podcast. So you have to really think about who the audience is,
Yeah.
who you're talking to. But I always say in each chapter, I break things out into chapters. It's like your first chapter, second chapter, third chapter, fourth chapter, fifth chapter kind of thing.
I like that. Yeah.
And in each chapter, you find those two sentences that kind of define you. So like I always bring in that I'm dyslexic. I always kind of bring that second, third grade story
Yeah.
in. I always talk about I played 2 sports in college because
Yeah.
again, when I say those two things, your audience, people they already are thinking of, oh, wait, okay. When I say what I'm doing now and all the different things, they kind of get a little insight into me before I'm even diving into my story. So like in
Sure.
each of those kind of things, we all have those two experiences, those one experiences that should always be woven into
Woven
your,
through. So each
but not
chapter of your
weirdly
life.
brought up. Yeah, but
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
weirdly broken up.
Right.
Like it's not like you would be
Yeah.
asking me about something and I would say, well, and then, like,
Yeah.
and bring something weird up. That's like, well, what is she talking about? No, you have to make it flow. And that's something you have to practice. Again, it's
Sure.
not,
Well, that
some people
gets,
do it better than others.
absolutely, it gets back to listening and playing off of the other person. And yeah, you wouldn't just start off with, hi, I'm Juliet Hahn. I played 2 sports in college. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Good
who
for you.
cares? Yeah, what's wrong with you? Yeah, exactly. So right, I set it up. Like I didn't,
Yeah.
the reason why I went to college is because I wanted to play sports. I hated school. If I didn't play sports, I would never have gone to college.
Sure.
I hated it with a passion. I sucked at it. It's really bad.
Well, for the record, I think team sports and sports as a whole just have such benefit and such,
Oh,
so many life
yes.
lessons
Love it.
you can take from sports. I love it. We're a big sports family. My
We are as well.
siblings.
Yeah.
So talk more, more recently, you mentioned the new role that you're in, and I guess talk about what you have going on these days in a little more detail.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can take you. So, like, my first podcast is called Your Next Stop. I interview people that have followed a passion and turned it into a business. And that's like, I do a little bit shorter. Because the other thing is, you have to think about when you're telling your story, are you going on a podcast that's an hour? Are you going on a podcast that's 30
Right.
minutes? Are you going on
Right.
a podcast that's 20 minutes? Okay. What should I bring in? And these are all the things. If you just continue to tell your story to yourself and do it recording wise, you'll hear, okay, I'm really comfortable with that. That's something I always should lead with. I always should do that, because when you're
Sure.
comfortable talking, people can feel it. When you're uncomfortable talking
Yeah.
about something, people
Yeah.
can feel it. And that's where you're not connecting. That's where the disconnect is. So that's what's really important. If you're faking it, and that's where you said the authenticity. I was gonna say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But so that is like what is really important to think about. But so now, because of the roles that I did, so Your Next
Yeah.
Stop, 30 minutes, it's like quick. It's like, it was started with women because that was the role I was in. And it was kind of where my life was going. And I was like, this is so
Yeah.
fascinating. And then it went into, I have 2 sons and I want to inspire them and a husband. So, I'm not a feminist, no offense to feminists, but like, I like to do equal
Yeah.
opportunity. If someone has a great story, I don't care what you
Sure.
are, who you are, I want to hear it. And I don't care how, if you're famous, if you can't tell a story, you're kind of dicky. Well, I don't want you on my
Yeah.
podcast. I don't, it's more of like that. Then I have YNS Live, like Your Next Stop live with NFL Thread. And that is kind of an offshoot of Your Next Stop. Cynthia Zordich, who is, her husband was in the league for 12 years, Michael. She was one of my first podcasts, or I shouldn't say first, because she was my 100th episode. And we dove into her story and I became fascinated. Again, I've said this a couple of times. I'm very curious.
Yeah.
So I was like, wait, I want to know, like, I'm a mom. Oh my gosh. Like when your husband got, and you had a business, what did you do with it? And I could just feel her like, oh, I got to think about this again. Yeah. I had to give it up. And then I was like, well, wait a second. So then we collaborated and we do a once a month, we have an interview, and it's either a wife or a spouse and what they're doing, not about,
a wife or spouse of a professional NFL athlete. Got it.
Strictly. And then, and what it's like, what are you doing? What are you doing outside?
Yeah.
And there's so many attorneys, philanthropists. I mean, so many different things that you're like, oh my God, why does anyone, because when you ask, can you introduce yourself? They always lead with what their husband does, and nothing wrong with it, but it's like, we want to know about you because we're also women and moms and whatever. And if you're not a mom still, like, how do you juggle all this? So we do live events at the Super Bowl, at the draft, and at
awesome.
And at the Hall of Fame. Yes. I mean, and if you go to my social media, you'll kind of see some of the fun things, but we interview really fun people. We also interview players when they leave the league. Nice. So what that transition looks like. And that is so important because so many people don't think about that. There's so much mental illness. I shouldn't say mental illness. There's so much mental stuff that goes through.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, we had Josh Kalinowski. He was a professional baseball player. He's a friend of mine. I got to know him over the last year a little bit. And he only played he was a pitcher. I think he got injured after 1 to 2 years. But it was like such a moving story because just his entire identity was wrapped up in that. And honestly, I could relate a little bit with my college lacrosse days, just because once, we shockingly lost actually in overtime, and it was like, whoa, what in the playoffs and national playoffs, and all of a sudden you're who are you? What defines you at that point? So I can only imagine, what Aaron Rodgers is going through right now. Is he going to
the Achilles? I mean, that's and also he's like older in his life. He didn't stop. Like there's so many things. And I think us as society, we don't think about professional athletes as humans, and they put their pants on the same exact way we do.
Totally.
And they're not all making this money that they can just be like, okay, I'm done. When you're done, you're one injury away. So we really get into some, I mean, we had Ricky Waters on and he was, he was crying, he and his wife. I mean, he
played for the Ravens. I think he might have retired with the Ravens, but he was awesome. But you're absolutely right.
He was an Eagle for a little while. Yeah.
Okay. So but it's like, and I think Miami as well, but anyway, he, you're absolutely right, especially with social media and then fantasy football and things, which I'm a huge fan of. We just treat these
I have my
people
teams.
like they're just commodities now. They're not actually humans anymore, which is a real shame. So Cynthia, your current co-host, was a guest on your 100th episode of Your Next Stop, right? And you're like, I love your story. We got to connect. And then YNS Live was birthed out of that connection. Is that right?
Yes. And so she has NFL Thread, which is the LinkedIn for women. And she had started that about 10 years ago. And so she would do a luncheon before the Thursday before all these events and get everyone together and be like, let's network with each other. Like, let's support each other's small businesses.
Sure.
Let's do this. Cause she's a connector, amazing woman. And so when she was on the podcast and we started doing this, she's like, I'm going to bring the podcast. Cause it's like the in-person. She also has a magazine that goes it's called The Playbook, that goes to every NFL team. So it was like the podcast, the playbook, and then the in-person. So we do sponsorships. If any of your listeners are like, wait, I want to get involved, just reach out, because we are going to be in Vegas this year and it is going to be huge. I mean, we get some really fun people that come. I have the podcast set up. You jump on, you talk, and we have sponsorship opportunities and all that kind of stuff. Pop-up shops. But that just birthed out of it. And it's those things I do. Again, we do, one interview a month. And then we do the live events and we get a lot of really fun content. I mean, I was at the Hall of Fame. I was literally in the back room with the gold jacket. I mean, all of the gold jacket guys.
That's
I'm like,
awesome.
Hey guys. So
cool.
My kids are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, how
did this happen, Mom? That's so cool. So
being curious and not saying no.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And then, so your third podcast, World Blindness Dyslexia Exposed, right?
Yep.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So my co-host is Brent Sopel, who was a former NHL Stanley Cup winner with the Blackhawks and severely dyslexic. Didn't find out until he was 32. His daughter was diagnosed, and he's like, wait a second. But basically, he's a Canadian. He was pushed through school because they were like, okay, you're going to be, I mean, he was on his own, went into the league basically at 16. So the other thing is we talk about, and this is why it's so close to my heart, we talk about so many different things, but he didn't know he was dyslexic. He knew that when he got out of hockey that he was not going to be able to get a real job in his mind because of his dyslexia, and he was never remediated. I mean, he basically was pushed through. It was like, okay, you're just going to go, you're the dumb jock, right? You're the dumb jock.
Yeah.
So he was in the league for 18 years, and he said he worked harder than anyone else because petrified that one step away from having to go into that real world. He went to Russia for 3 years to play, when it was like, okay, your time's up here. He was like, I played in conditions that probably no one else would ever, but I was like, I cannot do it. When he did leave the league, he did fall on really hard times. He's been sober and clean probably for 7 years now, has a foundation called the Brent Sopel Foundation, which is a dyslexic foundation. And he's doing amazing things. He basically helps a lot of people with that neuropsych that I talked about with the finances, because it's really hard. That's what his foundation does. He also coaches and runs a league, but we started that because, I mean, I know we're like short on time, but I basically was asked because of my podcast to interview him for a television show that's coming out. I can't even talk about when it was. I was connected through the podcast world again, because I put myself out there. I don't say yes if it's not something that I want to do. Like, I'm not the person that's like saying yes to everything and then being like, oh, I can't handle everything. I say yes when I know it feels right. I pray. So that's like what I do. Or I ask the universe. I take my walk. Hey, does this seem like something I should do? But so he and I then got connected, and I was like, I really want to help this foundation, because obviously dyslexia is huge in my world. And I have so many stories, and I help people. Like, I have people call me all the time, be like, can you give me a little advice on an IEP or here? And so I was like, we just need to put the words to a podcast. So we're on episode 5 came out today.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. Yeah. That's how some podcasts are born, is like two people are having conversations, and they're like, we should be recording this. And then they
every time we talk, we're like, oh my God, this is another episode. And
that's really cool. I had Justin Rothling-Schofer. He is a president of his company called Own It. He was actually fired by the NHL because he was working for a couple different teams as a trainer. I'm not sure if he played in the NHL himself, but he was let go because he was standing up for all these guys who were addicted to painkillers, and he was sick and tired of treating them like that. And so he kept standing up to ownership and management, and eventually they let him go. That's a really good episode.
What's his name?
Justin Rothling-Schofer. He's also Canadian, but I believe he lives in Florida now. But his company is called Own It. It's 2 words, Own It. And
I'm sure Brent knows him because he's Canadian, and he would stand up for things.
They do what they do now is they work with athletes and also just professionals and really anybody to create an individualized health plan. He's into like fitness and health, and blood work to figure out what your, I guess all of your epigenetic testing and all that stuff.
I love that.
So that was his adversity to abundance story, was getting fired from the NHL and then creating this company and now helping so many other people. But definitely recommend the listener go back and listen to that one if you haven't already.
So I want to go listen to that. Sounds great.
So you ready for some rapid fire questions, Juliet?
Yes, please.
Awesome. What is one thing that people misunderstand about you?
Probably sometimes my energy. They think I've been drinking coffee, and it's just who I am.
You don't drink coffee?
I don't need it. I wake up like this.
Jealous.
But when you're ADHD, it literally doesn't do anything to me. I don't feel it. It just, it's like, I already have the energy.
What's one of your biggest failures, regrets, however you want to frame that, but something you wish you could do over?
So it's funny. I know there's supposed to be like quick questions, but clearly, as you guys heard me, I don't do anything. It has to be a little bit of a breathy thing. I don't like to look back and say failures. I like to think anything that I've ever done, I've actually learned on them. And so I've been asked this question a lot, and there's not like there's not a one size fits all. I would have to say when I was raising my three kids, or when I'm raising my three kids, they're 2 years apart, a little less than 2 years apart. And there's definitely times that I wish I was more present, that I wasn't trying
Sure.
to get to bedtime because I didn't want them to be cranky the next day.
Yeah.
That I wish I was just like kind of, because I am go with the flow. But when it came to like kids and schedules, I wanted to make sure I was raising these great humans and I was thinking too much into things. And so sometimes
Yeah.
I wish that I just would have been like, just chill out
Just
a little bit.
relax a little bit. Yeah.
Mhm.
If you could give your 18-year-old self some advice, what would that be?
Just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, I just stay curious and don't think too much on things, and don't let the negative people ever make you think twice. I'm not one that usually does that, but there's definitely been people, that I've come across that sometimes maybe took the wind out of my sail a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
to, just don't worry about them.
Love that. If you were given $10 million tomorrow, what would you do with it?
So I would definitely help. I'm a service heart person. Dyslexia is one of those things that I would definitely want to help fund, get more kids, especially kids that don't have the funds to do. And then also boxer research boxer rescue is,
Mm,
I'm huge into, and just to help really animals and, children that don't have anyone that love them, really give them places.
yeah, that's great. What is one challenge that you're facing right now in your professional career?
So as you heard, I have some things on my plate. I also am raising
Yes.
three children. So
Yes.
I'm just trying to go with the flow and not putting too much thought into things. And
Yeah.
when I say I'm going to do something, that is, I do it. I have always been that way. If I say I'm going to get something done, I'm going to do it. But I also know that I can sometimes overextend myself because I get excited. I love, I'm excited about things. And just giving myself a little grace, not putting too much pressure on things like, okay, I need to maybe do that tomorrow, and I need to go to bed now and not stay up too late, because if I don't sleep, I'm a bit of a bear.
If you were to start a business tomorrow, not that you need something else to do, but if you were going to start a business, what would that be?
I mean, again, it would be in the storytelling space. I mean, kind of what I've been
Yeah.
doing, but it would really just help more people with getting comfortable with talking about themselves in not the egocentrical way, because I do feel the
Hmm.
world is a little me,
Yes.
me, me. This is not just kind of look outside, but be able to connect more with people by taking the egos out of your own story.
Mm, that's really good. What is a book or two that you could recommend for my listener?
So there's this book, and I have to look it up because I forget about it, but it's a mother's memoir, and it is one of the most beautiful books that I listen to. And it really, it is, it makes you cry, let's just say.
Mm,
And it's kind of in your time of your life where, um, I needed it, because we had just
hmm
moved. As I said, we lost a friend, and
hmm
it was like, okay, my kids are getting older, and I love being a mother. I mean, that was one of the things I always wanted to do. I was very
hmm
fortunate that I was able to stay home with my children
hmm
for as long as, I did. But it was definitely at a time where I was like, I don't want to let them go, but I know I need to like let them grow up a little bit. And I can't believe I can't find it. But it is a mother's memoir, and Katrina Kensick is the author. And I have 1,000, my daughter and I share our things. So I'm not going to say it, and I'm sorry. I can tell you later. Oh, here it is.
the gift of an
Again.
ordinary day.
Oh,
I just
yes.
looked it up. The gift
Thank
of an
you.
ordinary day. Awesome.
It is
Cool.
one of the most beautiful, beautiful books. Beautiful.
Awesome. Um, what is one question that I have not asked that you wish I had?
I think you did a fantastic job. I can't say that
Thanks.
there's anything that we did not get into.
Awesome. Coming from a three-time co-host, that means something. Where can our listeners find you online, Juliet?
So I am everywhere, and this is a funny story. So Juliet Hahn, like Romeo, Juliet, and my last name is Hahn, Hahn. There is also someone else out there with that name, believe it or
Mm,
not, and she is a Korean woman. So when you look it up, you're gonna be like, wait, that doesn't sound like the same person. And she's a professor at the Citadel. So
okay.
all my socials are I am Juliet Hahn, because she got it first. But so that is basically, LinkedIn is my name, Juliet Hahn. But everything else is I am, and same as my website. And you can find all the podcasts there. I kind of give like my favorite stuff. They all, you can search there, but you can also find them on all podcast players.
Awesome. Fantastic. Yeah, this has been really good. I know we have covered a lot of ground, and what I'm taking from this, among other things, is, look to your strengths. We all have strengths. I think this is going to be a very relatable episode for a lot of people. Not that everyone has dyslexia, but it's, I've had guests on the show where they've had a single engine plane crash or single, passenger plane crash, and should never have lived. And it was this dramatic story, and it's amazing. But most people can't really relate to that. And I think in a lot of ways, your story is very relatable. And also just that life has seasons and it's a journey. And just because you might hear signs or receive, signals that you should do something, and you should follow that for a while, but it doesn't mean you're locked in forever. But just that, play to your strengths and be a connector. I just love your positive energy, and obviously you've developed your listening skills and your creativity, even though you thought you didn't have that before. So the practical tips on podcasting, storytelling, man, this has been great. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate it. I obviously love sharing, and I love helping people really get to that thing, because, as I said, everyone has something to share, and we just need to listen. We need to listen to each other and respect each other a little bit more than I think sometimes the world does. And be happy for when you see someone doing something and you see that they're happy. Don't be the hater. Don't be like, oh, what are they doing? Be the person that's like, you know what? That's awesome.
Yeah, that is really cool. And for just to be clear, we did have to track Juliet down. Some guests are easier to get on the show than others. And like I said, I heard you on another show. I was like, I gotta get her on our podcast. So we finally were successful. So thank you for spending your time with us.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And to the listener out there, thank you for spending your most valuable resource with us, and that is your time. Don't forget to check out our website, adversity2abundance.com, the number 2, and like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. But the biggest thing is share. If you found this helpful, share this episode with a friend or family member. Thanks, everyone. Take care.